Mr. Raj Chengappa, Ambassador Suzuki, dear friends. First of all, let me say what a great pleasure it is to join you this morning, and I heartily commend your initiative because I do think that events like these would promote greater awareness about foreign policy, about international relations in the country, and also probably bring sharper focus on individual important relationships. So a great idea. Please keep it up. Look forward to seeing more of such events. Now, the first one in the series of what I was told was with Japan, and I've had the privilege of being associated with this relationship now for more than 25 years. It's good to see before me a number of colleagues who've been part of this journey. So I know that many of them would empathize with at least some of what I'm going to say to you. I would like to make essentially 10 points today about the relationship. The first point is that Japan and India have no negative history. And I say this because today a lot of international relations is being shaped in different parts of the world by what has been described as a return to history. So, in fact, if anything, Japan is viewed in India as having a positive role, as in many ways having contributed to the achievement of our independence. So, to the extent that there is any historical factor in the relationship, it is a positive factor. The second is that, like much of the world, or at least much of Asia, Japan is perceived in India as a model in terms of the transformation of a society towards modernity. That how Japan has embraced modernity while preserving its culture and its identity, its heritage, its traditions, I think is something which is very singular. It is something which is which many other societies, certainly India, has taken note of. Not just now. Perhaps today that debate is stronger in India, but over many years it has been an exemplar of harmonizing modernity and tradition. Related to that, I should also add that, you know, in any society, important relationships will always be the subject of political divide, especially in democracies. And the India-Japan relationship is one where there's actually a very deep national consensus that parties from the right to parties from the left have historically, consistently been supportive of the growth of this relationship, and that also, to me, singles it out. So the point I would make is that in an era where there's much greater global rebalancing, where countries today are bringing not just their capabilities, but their cultures, their perspectives, their heritage onto the international stage in order to democratize the international order. I think the relevance of Japan to India's prospects is even more than it was before. Now, my third point. For many years, for many decades actually, this has been viewed largely as a bilateral relationship. Not just a bilateral relationship, largely as an economic relationship, and particularly as an ODA-centered relationship, an official development assistance-centered relationship. So if we look at the relationship right till the 90s, I would say, it is very much a relationship that is centered around projects, around ODA support, essentially around finance and project development projects in the country. And in that sense, actually, it was a relationship where global strategy of either country had relatively little impact. And in many ways, you could argue that the period of the Cold War also created certain strategic limitations to the relationship. So, like it has happened with many of our other partners, the end of the Cold War opened up possibilities in the 90s. Opening up possibilities doesn't necessarily mean that they can be exploited quickly, but at least the doors were beginning to be open. So it has been, all said and done, a very harmonious relationship, a very friendly relationship, but if we are honest, in many ways, a relatively limited relationship, limited in its scope, in the intensity of the relationship, and especially in its strategic implications for the rest of the world. My fourth point, the business side. Japan has a very long business history in India. It's a business history which actually goes back to the 19th century. And interestingly, Indian businesses also have that long a history in Japan. There have been Indian businesses which went in there a few years after the Meiji Restoration. So we've had about 150 years at least of strong, sustained business. Even if, you know, I'm discounting the earlier era of trade, which of course goes back many more centuries. But the point to recognize is, while there was a footprint, sometimes actually not a small footprint, it was never a deep footprint. You had many Japanese companies here, but they didn't scale up in the way in which they have done in other geographies. And there's a very instructive comparison if you look at Japanese businesses in China, but forget China for a moment, look at Japanese businesses in ASEAN. If one was to look at Thailand or Indonesia or Singapore, I would argue that Japanese business has actually made far more serious investments there than they have done in India. There were a number of reasons for this. I think partly the enabling environment did not meet Japanese expectations, which essentially meant that the Indian system didn't particularly make an effort to get Japanese business in. There were infrastructure issues. There were, in some respects, cultural issues. And to some degree, Japanese businesses came up against domestic Indian business, competing in the same sector. So the combination of all of this actually has made what has been a history of 150 years a relatively limited economic player, and that's partly in evidence in the trade figures, Raj, that you shared with us. So now you will ask, what has changed? And I think the changes have been in evidence over the last 2 decades. Perhaps the first change, I would argue, is that Japan started approaching India with a strategic outlook. And for this, I would say that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was particularly and personally responsible. That he was very non-traditional in his approach to international relations. He was clearly trying to prepare Japan for a bigger role in the world, to secure its own interests more nationally. And I would sort of gather from both his actions as well as conversations which I've had or which I've been party to, that in his view, a Japan which goes out in the world needed more partners, reliable partners, and India fitted the bill. Now, this has broadly coincided with a period when India's own view of the world was shifting, the post-Cold War period when India starts improving its ties with the United States, with Western countries in general. So broadly, sort of a stronger strategizing on the part of Japan comes to meet a greater, I would say, a rebalancing in Indian foreign policy. And that's really begun, and I use the word begin, an era which is to me an era of change. Now, the other change has been on the economic side. Now, here we have seen a very visible pickup in Japanese investments. Japanese investments in infrastructure, but Japanese investments in business as well. But it's interesting to note that the greater investments have not automatically or sequentially translated into greater trade, because the nature of investments, as far as I can understand it, are such that they're not, Japan is still not using India as a platform to manufacture products back to Japanese market, which it is doing in China, which it is doing in ASEAN. So if you look at the Japanese investments in India, it is still somewhat different from Japanese investments in China and ASEAN, and that is why the trade figures are much flatter than the investment figures today. But that said, I think it should also be recognized that Japan has been responsible in many ways for triggering multiple, I would say, revolutions in India. The Maruti revolution, which actually was a lifestyle revolution in Indian society. The metro revolution, which really was an urbanization revolution in Indian society. And I'm very confident that when the bullet train gets going, the impact of that. I mean, I was in Japan when the metro was under discussion, the Delhi metro was under discussion. And nobody at that time could have really imagined what an impact metro would make, not just on Delhi. The fact that it is today become the driver of urbanization, of efficient urbanization in the country. Now, the issue today is, can we really raise the game? Can we take our relationship to a different level, strategically, economically, systemically? And here I would say the Modi government and the Prime Minister himself, they certainly are trying to make that difference. You can see that in the personal commitment of the Prime Minister to this relationship, the chemistry that he had with Prime Minister Abe, and that he seeks to continue with Prime Minister Kishida. The fact that we are today promoting exchanges at different levels so that there is actually greater systemic interface and greater systemic comfort between the two countries. Now, there have been some notable developments here, and each one of these hopefully will go forward in order to move the relationship. Part of it is actually creating a better climate for Japanese investments, Japanese business, encouraging greater Japanese participation in infrastructure, trying to bring our human resources into play. We have concluded a specialized skilled worker agreement, whereby in a certain number of professions, 22 if my memory serves me right, workers who are trained for the Japanese market can actually be eligible for employment there. There are today greater technology tie-ups which are happening. We are looking at sunrise sectors like 5G, like EVs. So you can see the relationship today actually make that effort really, as I said, to raise the level of the game and respond to the requirements of the future. Now, having said that, I would go back to the big picture. I do believe today the strategic compulsions on the two countries are much stronger, that the two countries are united in their desire to secure a multipolar Asia. And that would be, to my mind, realizable only if major countries like India and Japan work together closely to ensure that the diversity and pluralism of Asia is fully reflected in terms of the nature of power dispersal. The second point I would make here is that our maritime convergences are particularly strong. This is an area which I expect in the coming years to perhaps see challenges and stresses, partly because the global commons is left more and more to fend for itself. So that era where the United States shouldered the responsibility predominantly may be behind us, but there's no alternative solution readily in sight. So it's one certainly domain where India and Japan have a natural convergence, and I think those collaborative possibilities are whether it's visible in the Malabar exercise or in our agreements to deal with domains like IUU fishing. Those are areas where I think you can see greater willingness to work together. And finally, I do believe that the Quad will have a positive impact on the relationship. Now, that in a sense is a dynamic, because Quad itself would not have happened if India's bilateral relationships with the US, Japan, and Australia had not improved radically in the last 20 years. So the Quad is partly an aggregate of these improvements. But once the Quad has come into being, the cooperation which emanates out of the Quad, I think, has a reinforcing impact on each of these relationships. And I'm very confident, looking at the energy and interest in the Quad, that this will certainly help to charge up the relationship. So if I were to conclude, I would like to do so really with a set of questions rather than assertions or statements. I do want to make it absolutely clear that there's a huge appetite in India to grow this relationship. That whether it is the politics, the strategy, the security, the technology, the culture, there is no domain where there isn't room to grow, and I think we need to make that effort. But a lot of that will also depend on the openness of Japan. It will depend on how international Japan will be, how much Japan itself sees India's growth as a strategic factor in its interest, how much each one of us are willing to do to get out of our zones of comfort to build this relationship. I think these are today legitimate questions before the relationship, before this audience and the debate on the relationship. Obviously, it's a relationship about which I'm very optimistic. I see huge possibilities, but I also have seen enough of the relationship to appreciate that Realizing those possibilities will require continued effort, will require leadership focus, will require a systemic dedication. So I would at this moment call it out as work in progress, but work in progress moving in the right direction. So maybe on that note, if I could stop and
let's give the Foreign Minister a very warm round of applause for this. He was precise, lucid. He looked at the past, the present, and the future, and set the agenda. Dr. Jaishankar, and he's agreed to take a few questions from me, so thank you very much, Dr. Jaishankar. Let me start with what you said about the Quad, where you said relationships had enhanced and, the coming together of this. The spirit of the Quad was supposed to be security, but...
Sorry, I disagree with you there, but...
Yeah, I was coming to that question. That's what, we can talk about that. But this feeling is that partly because of COVID, this has moved to other issues of development, of health and security. So there's criticism that the Quad has avoided its main plank of containing China, countering China, and has now become something like the Asian Red Cross. Would you agree with this?
I think you underestimate what Red Crosses do. Look, let me say this as someone who's been involved not just in the change of our ties with Japan, but with the US and with Australia. You cannot nobody builds a relationship on one dimension. If a relationship moves, it moves on multiple fronts. So I disagree with the view that, as I said, I disagree with the view that Quad is fundamentally security driven. I think Quad is actually eventually a kind of a convergence of the interests of these four countries who are in four corners of the Indo-Pacific. And that set of interests, to me, is broad and open-ended. I mean, if you look at areas where Quad has moved, I mean, it could be from, let us say, from digital to health to education to maritime security to connectivity. So this, this is frankly, this is polemics in a way. It's like transposing. See, there was an era where the treaty walas defined the world. They still cannot believe that there is life without a treaty. So they are forcing a treaty on a non-treaty situation and say, if you're not conforming to this, you're not meeting a benchmark. The point is, something like Quad is a reflection of a completely different era. It's an era where four countries have decided that they are in a position to work together and contribute together. And sometimes, as I said, Red Cross makes a difference. Remember, the first time Quad came together actually was in a Red Cross situation, the 2004 tsunami. Okay? At that time, where was the deep concern about China? So let's not lose track of history. Let's not force a debate, which doesn't do justice to something which is a bigger effort, really.
Now, of course, China, Japan has concerns about China. We have serious concerns about China, particularly on the aggression, about its aggressive intent on our borders. If you take a look at what your your Chinese counterpart said, Wang Yi recently, he called the Quad the five eyes of intelligence, similar this thing. And he saw it as a sinister move that US was stoking tensions between China and India relations. And, is that something that you subscribe to, the view that this is largely US intended to strengthen?
Do I subscribe to a sinister view of Quad? I mean, first of all, Quad is four. Five eyes is five. So I learned my basic maths in second grade.
Well, he was talking about the alliance that was there between Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US and UK.
I mean, everybody is entitled to their views. We are very clear about ours. I think the Quad is the Quad. And I don't think the Quad should be confused for something which may exist, which may have a different history, different background, different players. I think that kind of transposition, that's part of political argumentation.
Are we stepping too gingerly on the issue of containing or countering China on the Quad? Therefore, the AUKUS comes. We don't want to be part, India doesn't want to be part of that security alliance on that front?
Raj, don't be so defensive about the Quad. I'm doing the Quad because it's in my interest to do the Quad. I see merits in the Quad. I have benefits out of the Quad. I don't have to go and apologetically explain Quad to countries who may have a different view. If they have a different view, that's their problem. I am very clear what it is about. And what it is about, please look, by now we've had 2 Quad summits. We've had multiple meetings of foreign ministers. They have put out outcomes. And please look at those outcomes. And there is an element of Red Cross in those outcomes. So look, I think today it's very important not to allow your view to be defined by competitors. It is equally important not to allow new developments to be straitjacketed into old history. I think these are 2 challenges which the Quad faces. I think we should be confident about it. I see no reason to be apologetic about it. To my mind, it's a new kind of diplomacy. It's also, it shows in many ways a different way in each of these countries, the 4 countries, of how they are approaching the world. Because Quad has required each one of them to do their foreign policy a little bit differently. So these are, well, not straws in the wind, they're stronger than straws in the wind, but these are actually changing trends in international relations. So I would strongly contest any effort to demonize it or to straitjacket it or to define it in terms which make you kind of defensive about it.
Sure. I was just looking at the fact of China, and you didn't use the word China at all right through this entire answer that you had given me. And so let me also ask this question, because as we said, there are common concerns that we have, and Quad was partly supposedly supposed to counter China or contain China. Arvind Kejriwal, the Chief Minister of Delhi, yesterday said that even though China continues to be aggressive on the LAC, as
we're talking foreign policy here.
Yeah, okay. Well, he's coming to foreign policy, and his question was, why is that? China, we've had the aggression in Tawang recently. Why is that India's trade continues to grow with China? In fact, it's grown from, he claims, from $65 billion to $95 billion. Why are we rewarding China? That's Kejriwal's question.
You want a serious debate or you want a Kejriwal question? Because the two are very different.
So let's just have a quick answer on that.
No, I'll give you a serious answer.
Right.
Because I think, this is posturing.
Right.
Look, what had happened after the 1990s, as we opened our economy, which we should have. I don't think anybody sensible would dispute it. We opened our economy in a manner in which we did not use that openness to strengthen our SME sector. They actually were deeply negatively impacted by that openness, because they found themselves unable to compete with imports which were coming in from other economies which had greater scale, bigger scale, and greater state and systemic support. So I would argue that this era, what we call proudly as an era of reform, was also an era where we did great injustice to our SME sector. We did not build our supply chains. We did not support our domestic vendors. So what you saw in many ways was a hollowing out of many sectors. There are specific sectors which actually moved out of this country and went northwards. So what has happened, when somebody says, why are there imports coming out of China? There are imports coming out of China because for 30 years, you did not give your industry the kind of support and protection which you should have. It's only now in recent years that you have started to do it. Now, you cannot reverse in 5 or 10 years what you have done over 30 years. So today, for example, if you look at the PLI, the production-linked incentives, it is actually encouraging manufacturing to come to India. But yet you have schools of thought in this country, I don't want to take names, you know who I mean, who say, well, we shouldn't even be manufacturing, our strength is in services. Now, you know, a country like India cannot pass up the manufacturing option. In fact, when I spoke about Japan being an exemplar, one of the things which Japan has done, I mean, look at the SME sector in Japan. Look at the domestic supply chains in Japan. So there may be those big Japanese companies which all of us know, but behind that are thousands of smaller Japanese companies who actually support them. Now, there are lessons to be learned from that. So, you know, this is not a question of suddenly I have a difficult relationship with a country, how do I switch it off? I mean, that's why I said that's not a serious remark. That's an, you know, you could say, well, you know what I mean.
Well, since we are on that subject, Rahul Gandhi, also, I don't know whether you consider a serious remark or non-serious remark, talked of the fact that India is hiding the Chinese.
You're trying to make my Monday morning?
This question, and then we'll move on, that India is hiding the fact that China has been, you know, has taken territory in the LAC and, you know, wants us not to, you know, to take on China. What is your view on this?
Today,
yeah.
I mean, you have yourself a fairly deep knowledge of the security situation. Today, you have a deployment of the Indian Army on the China border that we've never had. It's done in order to counter Chinese deployments which were scaled up massively since 2020. Now, if we were in denial, how is the army out there? Because the army didn't go there because Rahul Gandhi asked them to go. I mean, the army went there because the Prime Minister of India ordered them to go. So, look, at the end of it all, I understand today, politics is politics, okay? People will say things. They may not be credible. They may sometimes contradict their own positions, their own behavior. All that could happen. But the fact is, what is finally the proof of the pudding? The proof of the pudding is that the Indian Army today is deployed to counter any attempt to unilaterally change the LAC. So that's your answer.
And you're saying that's a fitting reply that India is giving to China?
No, I'm saying that is the obligation of the Indian state and that is the duty and commitment of the Indian military. You know, that we will not let any country, or in this case, China change the line of actual control unilaterally. So, you know, I think it's fairly obvious. I think most of the people of the country see that. So, you know, you can make your polemical points. I think people will treat it as politics.
Let's move to another area, and you were recently there at the UN Security, UN Security Council, where you, you know, addressed a session on counterterrorism. Mm-hmm. What is the kind? Japan is equally concerned about it, has been a partner with us. What can India and Japan do in terms of helping each other to counter terrorism? What is our, you know, do you look for them in terms of intelligence, in terms of software developments, technologies that can handle? And you mentioned one of the aspects of that was, you know, the kind of misuse of technology to foster terrorism. The 4 things that you said over there, one of that was that. Do you see any cooperation that India and Japan can have on terrorism?
No. Look, terrorism is a very complicated field because actually what happens in terrorism is everybody develops their capabilities and countries get into you can say, sharing or informing or assessment exchanging relationships. So I wouldn't necessarily single out terrorism. It could be broader than that. But when you have a good strategic relationship with any partner, then part of that is really to shape your, to have those exchanges, and then the systems get comfortable with each other, and there are benefits that flow from it. But the fact is that while we are, of course, both Asian countries, we are located at two very distinct sub-regions, which each have their own challenges. But in this day and age, look, you never know who's helpful where. I mean, you'll be amazed at the countries, with whom we work sometimes. So I would look at it much more in terms of fostering that kind of systemic comfort, rather than necessarily narrowing it down to terrorism.
Now, on the subject of terrorism, India and Pakistan relations touched a new low with the strong language used by your counterpart, Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto. Your comments on the fact that of the way he spoke.
Sorry?
What do you say about the way he spoke? And
I think my ministry has said very clearly what we think about what he said. So,
which is, I mean...
No, which is out there. I think we've said what we had to say.
Weren't you upset the way he spoke, the way he said everything that, talked of India and the way he talked about Prime Minister?
Well, let's put it this way. Our expectations levels with the Pakistanis are never very high.
Okay. I know, we come back right to Japan. In terms of the fact that we are the G20 president, as well as Japan as the G7 presidency, how do you see us working together on some of the key issues of the world? Do you see some of the big things that we could take up together? We are the, G20 president, and Japan is the G7 presidency. Of course, G7 is represented over there, but is there ways we can work together to collaborate this?
Well, yes, because look, the G7, after all G7 members are G20 members. So together they are, more than a third of the G20 membership, and because they work as a group, they obviously are able to put their points of view across very, very strongly. So my sense is that when we look at the state of the world, look at issues today of debt, look at issues of digital challenges, health challenges, connectivity issues, there are, reform of multilateral institutions is something which Japan is as committed as we are. We are actually partners when it comes to some aspects of it. My sense is there will be a significant convergence between what the G7 under Japan is trying to do and what the G20 under India is trying to do. Our effort, we want to run a G20 which is very, very broad-based, which takes in as much inputs from as many parts of the world as possible, so that what it produces is actually serious and relevant and, in a sense, meets the demands of the day. So my sense is that you will see India and Japan working very closely on this G7, G20 connect.
Now, one of the issues is the global value chain, and this is my final question to you. India had hoped that the China plus one means India. What can, and Japan seems to, as you had mentioned earlier, look towards ASEAN countries in terms of investment, in terms of manufacturing, not looking at India. What do you think could turn the relationship on this? What is it that we can do ourselves, and what can Japan do to ensure that we become a greater part of the global value chain and be, seen as an alternative to China in some senses?
This is a fundamental question which has arisen, not just for Japan and India, not just for Japan. but for the entire world from the COVID experience. The COVID experience actually taught us what happens when there is over-concentration in a particular region, and I'm not saying this as a political point, any region or any country. If there is over-concentration, you have actually multiplied the risks. So you had COVID. Now COVID shut down a certain geography, and then the entire world was impacted. Okay, today it is COVID. Tomorrow it could be something else. It could be a massive climate event. It's very, I would say today the global economic security requires actually a much more decentralized globalization. It needs multiple production sectors. It needs redundant, resilient supply chains, more reliable supply chains, multiple supply chains. So the effort of the Modi government today to build up greater manufacturing in this country, to my mind, actually captures this moment when there is a demand in the world also to see more centers of manufacturing. And it's in, if you have to, every country will de-risk today its future by having multiple relationships. It can be in manufacturing, it could even be in food, it could be in health. So I see a new conceptual, a very pragmatic basis today why India, Japan should actually get more strongly into a supply chain relationship, both for their own mutual good as well as a contribution to the world. And in fact, we have an initiative along with Australia, three of us, to actually look at how to build more reliable supply chains in this part of the world.
I know your time's up and you've got to attend Parliament. Thank you very much, Dr. Jaishankar, for this. Let's give him a very warm round of applause for this. Thank you so much.